Okay, folks. So, buenas tardes and bienvenidos a todos. My name is Dr. Valerie A. Martinez, and I'm the History Program Head and Assistant Professor of History at Our Lady of Lake University. And I welcome you all to the last installment of the Critical Pedagogy Workshop Series. Yay, we did it. And again, this series was designed to introduce educators and community members, anybody essentially who engages with students, to practices and strategies associated with promoting inclusivity and equity. So whether, again, this is in a classroom setting, or if this is within your own student organizations, or during a community-sponsored event, we see that anybody really can apply these settings. And as Dr. Rosalind Evans told us a couple of days ago, you can apply these in your workspace as well. So thank you all again for joining us. I thank our institutional sponsors, including the Office of Academic Affairs and the OLU Center for Mexican American Studies and Research, as well as Humanities Texas, for funding this programming. So we have a great group of workshop facilitators that you've been seeing and participating with throughout the year. So I would like for each of us, as we go around and kind of this is going to be really an informal conversation with Dr. Aimee Villarreal, again, director for the Center for Mexican American Studies, moderating this conversation. So as we each kind of go around, if you could reintroduce yourself. I know that I had elaborate bios for each of you because you are amazing scholars. So instead of going through each of these bios one by one again, we just, name and title would be great. And we can just start with our conversation. So thank you again. And Dr. Villarreal, we can, if you want to, begin the session, that would be fantastic. So thank you all again in the audience for joining us.
I'd like to first have everybody introduce themselves. And so we'll start with Dr. Cepeda.
Hi, friends. My name is Candace Zepeda. I'm the chair of undergraduate and graduate English, and most recently, the new Ruben and M. Veronica Salazar Escobedo School of Mass Communication and Theater. We're working on shortening that a little bit.
And could you tell us a little bit of a summary of the workshop that you gave?
Yes, I hosted a workshop on anti-racism pedagogy, as well as the practices that we can include in our classrooms.
Okay, very good. And Dr. Grosjean.
Hi there, I am Dr. Jane Grovajan. I am a theologian by training. I am an associate professor of theology and spiritual action. I did a presentation and continue to think about and wonder about, not yet dream about, the reality of how we address anti-Blackness within our lives, within our education, within the structures in which we live.
Okay, okay, thank you for that. Professor Becerril.
Hi, everyone. I can finally join the Doctors Club. I just successfully defended my PhD dissertation. So
My apologies, Dr. Becerril.
No, it's exciting. And so my training, though, is as a speech language pathologist. So I typically work with children with language disabilities. And so I did a presentation, facilitated a discussion on anti-ableist approaches to disability, to work with disability awareness.
Okay, wonderful. And I believe Dr. Martinez also did a presentation. So we already have had her introduction, but could you give us a little summary about what you did in your workshop?
Yes, so my workshop was back in October, folks. We've been doing this again for this entire academic year. So back in October, we began the series with my presentation on utilizing an anti-colonial lens. So how we're looking at decentering colonial practices within our classroom, knowingly and unknowingly, and how we are also attempting to both decolonize this space as well.
Right. And so today we are missing Dr. Evans, who gave the workshop last week on moving beyond the gender binaries that we are seem to be very familiar with and often reproduce without our knowledge. And she talked a lot about pronouns and the importance of being inclusive in the classroom as far as gender identities and expressions are concerned. And then we're also missing Professor Vasquez, correct? Did she do, yes, Professor Vasquez did one of the first critical pedagogy series workshops on decolonization, correct? And indigenous, kind of centering indigeneity. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. And so what I'd like, and it's an open meeting, so everybody can ask questions and get involved in the dialogue. And so I encourage you to do so. And so I want to go around the round table, and maybe if you can talk a little bit about what do you think was the most important thing that people should take away from your workshop or your presentation as far as concepts are concerned. So the broad overarching, maybe theoretical concepts that you presented in your workshop. And we'll go ahead and start with Dr. Cepeda.
So I was part of the early crew when I presented, which was last semester with Val. And since that time, we continue to see violence across the country on particularly brown and Black bodies. And let me go ahead and add young brown and Black bodies. For me and for my workshop, one of the biggest takeaways I wanted people to understand is demystifying what anti-racism is. It's a scary term to some who are unfamiliar with the term. You know, nobody wants to be racist. Nobody claims to outwardly be racist. And anti-racism as a pedagogy has existed for a considerable amount of time. I introduced Kendi's work, which he has sort of brought that conversation back into mainstream America. It became a bestseller overnight. It was not his first text, by the way, but those conversations have existed in educational spaces for a while. And so, you know, anti-racism isn't something that we should be afraid to study, but some of the major takeaways is, you know, action. It is rooted in action. Ultimately, how are you creating spaces that are inclusive, not with, and speaking primarily about educational spaces, not with additional readings or supplemental readings, or maybe one or two additional readings by voices of color. How are you flipping that narrative? Is sort of the conversation I wanted people to do. That is the actionable item, but not only with our books and our curriculum, but also with the kinds of assignments that we carve out. Are we looking at those without a voice? You know, and then how are we doing that in the assignments and curriculum we're doing it? So, you know, to provide like a tangible example of that, in any of my classes, even in graduate classes, and many of us already do this actively, and you don't even know that you're engaging in anti-racist pedagogy. We create reflection or metacognitive opportunities to basically express what they learned from the assignment. You know, metacognition is a really an anti-racist opportunity for us to see what other things are going on in our students' lives. You know, for me, often it's an opportunity for a student to say, I know I'm quiet, I know I miss class, but these are the things that are happening in my personal life. So it's another way to bring a voice out, and that's something many of us already do. So other than demystifying it and expressing that anti-racism is about being active, I also wanted people to know that it begins with a study of yourself. You know, within the last year, particularly the last year, I've had several colleagues from this university and other universities who want to step it up, who want to participate, who want to learn how they can be more inclusive in the classroom. And often I'll have wonderful conversations, but I always go back to what I say. This is uncomfortable work. It means you have to do the work. I can't summarize his position. I can't summarize other voices and scholars of color's position. It means you're going to have to do a sense of self-reflection and understand ways that you've participated in things that maybe would be identified as racist. either participating in policies or participating primarily by not saying anything at all. And so ultimately, we all have room to growth. I have room to growth. It is not something that you check off in a box and say, I'm anti-racist, I'm done, I can go on with my life. This is constant study of our practices, and sometimes daily and sometimes weekly. And all of us in this room have a benefit of having that self-reflection every semester. And we can modify our syllabi every semester.
Right. Okay, thank you for that. The self-reflection, moving from the idea of not racist to anti-racist, and then also how to apply that, of course, in the classroom, both with students as you're also a form of growth in yourself as a professor. Wonderful. Dr. Grosjean, you also presented about anti-Blackness. And perhaps we can start with maybe your understanding of the difference between, say, an anti-racist position and anti-Blackness, or how maybe they're related in your presentation, and what was kind of the overarching goal of your practice.
Good question. Thank you, May. They certainly are related. I think I was drawing from and working within a well-developed theological set of voices that are brave and are broken. And I think for me, that's a powerful dynamic, because theologically, none of us want to be broken. We have these narratives of God and victory and power and glory and goodness, when our narrative is really the opposite. So pulling from those spaces of pain and power in the Black voice, and recognizing the Black liberation, right, that's been going on in our nation for decades, of course, but also seeing the historicity of anti-Blackness. And the scholars I was drawing from were looking at ways in which, if I use the proverbial metaphor, anti-Blackness is in the air. None of us escape it. It's literally embedded in the founding of our nation. It's embedded in our policies. It's embedded in our practices, the way we think. So to begin to recognize in ourselves, as Candace was saying, deep scrutiny of ourselves. And I tried to locate myself there in terms of my own interrogation of my ability, on one hand, to listen to places of suffering and places of powerful revelation of the holy, while missing it in my own more immediate context, and beginning to simply problematize that. Just, okay, what's up with that? Like, why was I unable to see that? And then to recognize that there are, of course, intersections within anti-Blackness and ways in which racisms function in our nation. And I was trying to locate the historicity in some ways of anti-Blackness as an element, really, that stems and goes back to the very founding of our nation. So beginning to unleash and open up opportunities for Black divinity, Black humanity, expressions of joy in my own experience, my own life, being deeply marked, I will say, by anti-Black prejudice, and wrestling with that in my own life, and being very wounded by that, needing and recognizing in my own experience. And Candace, as you say, we're fed a steady diet of death. We're so surrounded and immersed in violence, it's hard for us to imagine anything else. That I need, and that I'm insisting, a takeaway for me, and it's a challenge for all my colleagues, to really create and to be wed to concrete instances of Black joy. That I think there's a real reality among our students, whether they're 20 or 30, they've been fed a steady diet of Black misery and Black death and the criminality, right? Some of those many stereotypes that we know, and that I need as a theologian and as a professor to consciously counteract that from within my discipline, as well as the other takeaway for me. And it's a takeaway I would love to have more conversations with you about: where do we locate ourselves in the African diaspora? How do we situate ways in which Latinx or Afro-Latinos are part of this longer story? And how do we create bridges right? Between the Chicano movement here in the United States, the United Farm Worker movement, as well as the traditional civil rights movements, they're still so split. And I am in the middle. And then my last piece is just a resonation. I want to resonate with something Valerie had said. Um, how do we decenter whiteness? How do we decenter whiteness in our classrooms? How do we decenter whiteness in our worship, in our families? That's a harder question, I think, given the normalcy of the academic realm. But my main takeaway really is to see ourselves within anti-Blackness. None of us are free of it, and to find our own roots in it and how we have lived off those roots, how we think those roots have made us who we are, given us life, and recognizing it's a long, slow, and steady poison. And to begin to pull up some of those roots and to acknowledge these are places of pain. And there's also a powerful revelation of the holy within that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that. I was thinking about Christina Sharp's book, In the Wake, in which she calls anti-Blackness the weather, the actual weather in which we live in and sometimes are unaware of, even as the rain is falling on our heads, right? And the idea of liberation for everyone and what that looks like, what that can mean for a movement within yourself, but also liberation from the habitus, right? These behaviors and ideas and concepts that have shaped, right, our culture. You know, the culture, or we could call it the white settler state, right? The emergence of the white settler state. So going to that theme, I guess we'll start with Dr. Martinez. We'll go to Dr. Martinez and the decolonial. So why don't you take it from there?
Yeah, so I kind of teeter also kind of on Candace's workshop on using anti-racist pedagogies, right? So like you have to use those in conjunction with recognizing, you know, anti-Blackness within our communities, right? With promoting not racist, but actively being an anti-racist, right? So all of that kind of goes with as we are trying to use an anti-colonial lens. Now, it is very hard because as we've known through each of these workshops, we have been conditioned to recognize what is quote unquote normal, right? We have been conditioned to recognize normalcy. We've been conditioned to internalize these ideas and concepts, right, surrounding gender, sexual orientation, race, right, and et cetera, et cetera. So it's very, very difficult to do, but you have to attempt to recognize it where it stands. So that can be from just the framework that you are using to envision X assignment, that the framework that you are using to teach, you know, Y book. So you have to disrupt that, and it's really hard to do. And like, okay, so how do I even do that, right? And I'll give you an example. For our history classes, for example, in a public history class that I taught this past fall, actually, usually, you know, I teach in the spring, but this one I had to teach in the fall. But we really I was really hoping to engage with the students in terms of decolonizing these public spaces. So in terms of public spaces like museums, a really great resource again is decolonizing. It's actually called Decolonizing Museums. It's by Amy Lonetree, and this one is a fantastic book to how we start really trying to attempt to decolonize these public spaces, right? So you can put the work in, and now that means utilizing regular texts that are published by authors who write X textbooks for X classes and recognize coloniality within them, right? Within that framework. And then you have to show the students, okay, recognize this. So this person is saying, oh, the first way to create an exhibit is you have to engage, you have to recognize the stakeholders. So look at the institutions, look at the other academics here, look at, right? And then you have to recognize you as the instructor, and then coupled alongside these other texts, you have to recognize, okay, great, where's the community? So you're creating an exhibit on the indigenous peoples of the Americas. Where are the tribes? Right? So again, within even just the textbooks itself, you have to condition yourself to and train yourself to recognize those frameworks that we have been teaching, and you have to go in and disrupt those yourself, right? And then in terms of, like I said, we're trying to decenter whiteness. So I was on a panel a couple weeks ago, a really great panel put on by Dr. Chris Carmona from the RGV. And yes, thank you, Candice, or thank you, Dr. Sabetha, for putting that in there. And he put this panel is called Güeros, Prietos, and Bolillos, and have how we're looking at colorism and anti-Blackness within the Latinx community, right? So here we had scholars such as Daniel Delgado, Silvia Mendoza, um, Sandra Garza, huge scholar on looking at the impact of colorism in the Latinx community. And, you know, we're trying to play around with ideas on how do you decenter whiteness. Well, according to Dr. Mendoza in her talk, and it's on Facebook if you want to, you know, go and check it out. It's a really good, you know, really great panel. But she talked about using and darkening epistemologies, right? We have to look at these and darkening epistemologies where we can decenter whiteness. And that for me, for example, as a historian, I look at specific primary documents and we look at the trajectory, we look at the historical legacy of using whiteness within the Latinx community and how that becomes disrupted and how scholars have been disrupting this, right? So, and then that also allows you to push beyond, again, the binary of white and non-white, right? We got to push even beyond that. Why is it just white and non-white? So you got to push even beyond those. So that is how we try to kind of decenter. And again, we've been conditioned to look and to see what is the status quo and to work within that framework. It is up to us collectively to push beyond and disrupt those frameworks that we've been using. And it's hard to do, but like Dr. Sabetha says, you got to put in the work. We all have to put in the work. And thankfully, these great panel of scholars have done a lot of that work for you in terms of putting together a list of resources, which we will all share. So, I mean, it's there for you. Now you just gotta, you know, Dr. Speth putting a whole list of recommended reading for the summer. Let's do it, y'all. We have to. I mean, we can just sit there and talk about it all we want, but it's gonna be moot unless we actually put this to practice. So, thank you.
I really appreciate your emphasis on practice, which is, you know, what we do is changing, you know, ideas, right? Hearts and minds and ideas, but that only changes about 10%, right? Actually, what we're trying to do is change behaviors. And that actually takes a lot more work, more reflection, that more decolonization, I would say, of the self, right? And so I was also struck by, well, as frameworks are concerned, so we teach a lot about immigration, many of us do. And so the normative way is to say, well, we are an immigrant nation, but that actually excludes Native people and also people brought here that, you know, that were brought here, kidnapped from Africa and brought here against their will. So if we say that we are a settler state, and a white settler state, that actually shifts the lens on how we speak about immigration, right? And so that would be, again, that decolonial move. So yes, definitely wonderful. So now we go to Dr. Newly Doctored Becerril and other forms of difference. Of course, we're talking about intersectionality in these in this roundtable. So we would like to offer your perspective on ableism.
Yeah, so many good things here already, and I'm gonna pop a few quotes there in the chat. I'm thinking about your idea of, you know, what sort of theoretical things did you want to or did you try to explore in your presentation? And so I'm going to kind of bring it back there. And really, I know with Dr. Martinez, in a group I was with her, we were looking at this idea of pedagogy. And so I love that you brought up this idea of, you know, what were the theoretical aspects you were looking at? Because I love this quote by Jerome Bruner, where he talks about to separate pedagogy either from the disciplines of knowledge that must be translated by it, or from the study of human development, is to cripple pedagogy and impover us all. And so Dr. Martinez also mentioned epistemology. And so really it's a continuum. And I think in academia, we can kind of talk about some of those things like how do we know what we know at an epistemologic level? And then the theory, which are some of those like tenets and breaking it down more. But then as Dr. Zepeda was saying too, it gets to practice and pedagogy, how are we translating that? And as educators, that's our role, so this idea of awareness, I love that in these different conversations, and awareness is hard. And so I think it does take a concerted effort, but I think one of the ways that as educators we can help kind of peel back some of those layers for our students and then also for our peers is to offer some conceptualization, some frameworks, and then opportunities to reflect. So I know in my presentation, I talked about a conceptualization of the social versus medical model of disability, because I know, all these different isms, we're all working towards the common thread that I see is this idea of an inclusive pedagogy and an inclusive environment that we want to create for our students, and recognizing all of them and all these components to them. And so ability being one of those aspects. And so I talked about this dichotomy and framework of the social model of disability and the medical model, and for anti-ableism and disability awareness and the people who study that, specifically disability studies, they talk about one framework and way that educators can approach this. And I loved how Dr. Martinez was kind of getting into this. One thing that they talk about are principles of UDLs. And I am also going to pop that into the chat. But because I think, like she's mentioned, you can look at things that you're already doing and start there. I think awareness, there's so many layers to this, but I would just encourage anyone who's at this, in this conversation, even if you can just start with one aspect of your syllabus or one lesson or one assignment and go through some of these lenses. So thinking about is the design of that assignment or assessment, is it going to be useful to everyone in your class? This idea of being flexible, this idea of tolerance for error. I love that. This idea of, creating a space where there's a community of learners, and just being really aware of the environment that you are creating. So I don't know. There's so many good things there that everyone was saying. And I am still, as Jane was talking about, I am still also in this process of grappling with all the great things that you guys have all presented on, but it's really exciting to see how they all, can relate and, overlay on one another. So I'm excited to keep this conversation going.
Yes, I think the takeaway of that medical model and the social model, thinking about ableism and ability and disability, was very, very helpful, especially the flipping the script, on the little video that you showed. That was actually pretty powerful for me. So I would like to now turn to praxis. So many of you brought up, the broad overarching kind of theoretical frameworks that you were working in. And I was, and then, the second workshop was about praxis. It was about pedagogies and what kinds of actual lessons or ideas you could present, dialogues you could present, resources that you could present in the classroom that would get at these topics, right? These forms of disruption. So I would like to go to each of you now to speak about either a resource, a lesson that you've done, something maybe that you are working on right now that is really trying to get at making these theoretical concepts tangible in the classroom. So I'd like to go first with Dr. Zepeda.
Yeah, actually, I wrote a whole chapter on this that that talks about how I did it with a graduate class. So I'm obviously in the field of English, and this is a particular course rooted in future pedagogy of literature and composition and poetry. And rather than focusing on each one of those genre forms, I look at it through a postmodern and decolonial lens. One of the things that sometimes people who don't know about anti or decolonial praxis, why the entire cases. For me, I problematize it. So this together. That's one of the first they talk about the history. It's a language literacy. And another author where we could, and I mirror in most of my class way. This is what are ways that we can share our mind that in many cases with this alternative. And that required it's really language of our area. Language helps students begin to process that language or of the way we're invite into that conversation that their own area. And
Okay, yes, I'm seeing your picture now and not your video, but I could hear you. So, and what I heard is the pairing of different types of text, reading them in an overlapping way, and also to deconstruct language and also remake it in ways that make sense to us from different perspectives. So, very great, very wonderful suggestions for use in the classroom. And we can add to it once we get to the round table. So Dr. Grovejan, any lessons or resources that you could offer?
Lots and lots, maybe not as many success stories, right, as my peers. I want to share a current conundrum just because I'm in it, taking seriously my role as a theologian to decenter traditional depictions of holiness, of divinity, of humanity, and that great warp of life. So in the spirituality class, I intentionally decentered and said that right very clearly. And I wanted to bring in the spiritual stories, and there's just oodles and oodles of them, but I chose a simple text, Parable of the Brown Girl. And I found myself in the midst of this, Reverend Christy Lauren Adams is the author, and she brings to us plethora of life experience. And I found an interesting phenomenon occurring. I'd set it up saying, okay, so what happens when we go to the margins, right? And I can do all the theological justification of that and spiritual journey and all that wonderful stuff. And then I'm bringing in the story, right, from Starr County, from the experience of many Mexican Americans and their spiritual struggles and realities in the 60s and 70s and 80s, and connecting these two. But it's interesting, the pushback that I get, which is not surprising, I suppose, the typical sort of white privilege, even amongst students who aren't white, that the expectation, if I have an author, and I do, I've got one bow to the white male. No offense to any white males out there, but again, that's front and center, right? So that they've articulated a perspective that comes from the mainstream that's overdone. And I'm going to use a word now that I don't mean to be insulting, but it's kind of tired. It's kind of a tired narrative. And I say that because it's a small portion of humanity. And right. So in the saying of that and the telling of that, other people are silenced. So I switched it around, but people still migrated back. So they tended to see the white narrative as the voice. That's the one who's doing theology. This is the one I connect to when the amount of time, the kinds of assignments, the reflective moments, they had artistic moments. It was clear to me the students related in an experiential level to the parable of the brown girl, to some of these writings coming out of the Texas farm worker struggle, the United Farm Worker struggle, the realities going on in RGV and ways in which we saw human rights realities embedded. So giving them that opportunity, okay, here's where we looked at this element coming from spirituality and understanding of this livingness of the holy in our midst. What are the things that get in the way of that? We looked at documentaries, but the difficulty is helping them see their own divide, so to speak. And I let, maybe this is wrong-headed, but I let them sit in that. I don't try to take them out of it. Part of that rupture, I want them to see the rupture. They feel it, but it's like it's not integrated yet in the frontal lobe. And it's painful. And I want to be there with them in that space, but also insisting on the primacy of this parable of the brown girl. So I got a lot of pushback, both in terms of gender. Why are we only studying women? Well, we're not only studying women, right? We're studying the stories of their lives. They cover comprehensive realities, mental health, suicide, addiction, realities connected to abuse, all kinds of life stuff. They see that, they responded to that, but they only are willing to see the lens within a very specific color or gender. So the reality for me was really split along those lines. Although students did say actually very heartbreaking things for me. I've never had a religious studies class or a class in which I was ever asked to look at my own life experience as a brown woman. That's crushing. I know that's true, right? So I can lift those up and then asking them to problem solve, like to problematize and say, okay, so you don't see yourself in the story. Tell me more about that. And we were able to build a little bit of that lattice work, but I realized I'm still in the gap. And that gap for some, as soon as they think that I'm, how do I say this? I'm enforcing a script on them. They don't want to be part of it. They don't like, well, this isn't what I get. This isn't what I hear in other resources. And it was a wild experiment. And I would say overall, it's been successful. But I would love to hear more from others in terms of how do you mentor students in that place of rupture when rupture is part of what we're living. And I also, it was, we were, and these are powerful narratives through the Equal Justice Initiative. I love these stories, and it sounds like a weird thing to say because it's ordinary people talking about reclaiming histories of people who've been lynched. I connect it with also the history here in Texas and the border and the stories here. They don't know any of these stories, and they see them still as completely separate. So noticing that difference too. So when we're looking at the stories through the Equal Justice Initiative of people who identify as African American in very diverse circumstances, very powerful, beautiful, haunting stories full of spiritual truth, connecting that back. And then we come here to the historical stories. And of course, right, it makes sense. They wake up. It's like, oh my God, that's my ancestor, right? So I have them write letters to Eleanor Roosevelt because we found all these wonderful historical archives of letters that she wrote to individuals about lynching in America. But the hard part for me, and I'm going to shut up now, that place of rupture, and I think it's important because they need to see the break, but also, and this, I don't present it this way in the classroom, but there can be no justice for the dead. we're kidding ourselves. Whether we're talking about Chauvin's verdict or we're talking about our dead ancestors, right, killed by the Texas Rangers, there can be no justice for the dead. So that I don't want us to try to make it okay for them. We can't. We have different kind of work here to do, and I don't want them to be crushed in the process.
Wonderful. Yes, very powerful statements here. It reminds me of, and I'm sure those of you who read Gloria Anzaldua's concept of the Coahuila state. That's the breaking, right, with that former narrative, right, that narrative that blinds us to these realities. And that for her, it's like a state of spiritual sickness in which she has to come to a kind of place of healing from it. And that's part of the process of decolonization. And that is the process of coming to consciousness, and that it is not easy, right? It's actually an ongoing process in your life, and also can be a painful one, that breaking, but also a necessary one in her view. So thank you for that. So next we'll go to Dr. Martinez. Think since we're on the subject of decolonization, what types of assignments or resources can you offer?
Yes, so and again that other panel that I was in, I was showing like the primary documents that we use for looking and really engaging with whiteness, right, in this legacy, and how that also kind of can includes, right, I know we talked about this before, but like how it can also include anti-blackness, right? So we look at a couple of court cases. So I was going to include the link, and then Jane said something about how we're looking and looking at these narratives of history. So then I copied and pasted another link here, so I lost that other one that I copied, but I'll still do both. So what I have right now, I'll show the links of the primary documents in a second, but this link that I'm including, this link is coming out of TCU. So Dr. Max Krochmal led this huge oral history on civil rights in Black and Brown, right? So one of the assignments that I use to really have students understand these issues within their own families, within really trying to have them create and produce history, right? We're trying to look at historical erasure. We're trying to, again, disrupt those predominant narratives. And I do that through oral history. So many of you know that, I'm also an oral historian, and I implement this in all my classes. So this students who take 1302 will conduct an oral history at some point. Like, well, no, they will conduct it. Other history majors will also conduct an oral history at some point, because this is, we look at this legacy of storytelling within the communities and how this is also empowerment. There's lots of different scholars who speak about this, right? And but if they are unable to conduct an oral history, then they still must listen to one. So we use this website. So Jane, I'm going to check out the Equal Justice Initiative. I think that's a really great. Yeah, I'm going to include that also as another possibility. So here's another one where you can actually listen to the full length interview. It's in clips, but here they're needing to make and analyze these stories. And then in terms of, again, the primary documents, I'll include the presentation and then also a link to the resources. These are right here. But here in these documents, again, you don't have to just do history in order to engage with this material, but if you're, these are really looking at the connections between whiteness and how that was associated with aspects of with citizenship, right? And how so though I have a couple of slides on there that you could see on how you can make those kind of connections with students. And then here's actual court cases that you can see where they're using these strategies. So I hope those are kind of helpful as well. But if you were, obviously you're not everybody's a historian here, right? We all have our different strategies that we use, and I, like Jane, I invite to listen to the way that you have done these practices in your classroom. But I know that, for example, the Mexican American Teachers Academy, directed by Dr. Liliana Saldana, she also incorporates math. So this is not something that we're very much focused on humanities, and we thank Humanities Texas again for funding this, but there's ways that we can do these practices in fields outside the humanities as well. So I know that Candace also had resources on how to do this in biology. Again, there's ways to do this in math as well. And on the resources that I have as well, it has on how you can do these outside these predominant, humanities-based fields. But we can, yeah, I mean, we can all work on these items. It's not completely just focused on humanities. But so I hope those are kind of assignments and resources. I know we're running out of time, so I'm going to cut mine, keep mine a little bit short. Yeah, let me know if you need if you can't access those. I think I have the link open, so. Oh, and
Yes.
lastly, sorry, as a way to also kind of disrupt that whiteness strategy and narrative, we also look at a podcast. So I included a couple of songs on there that I use, and I just found or refound the Ethnic Studies podcast that we created last summer. So and it's on Spotify. So I'm gonna also put that in the link. So you can use Way music, right? And I know Jessica's in here, and we could talk about how I mean the power of orality, right, in terms of social justice issues, right? Yeah, and then the link that I also included to the Indigenous scholars led by Dr. Katrina Phillips. You can again we're showing how we're like Kenna said, we're problematizing, we're disrupting, we're interrogating these issues. Listen to Indigenous scholars, read the books. We have to immerse ourselves within these methodologies as well. So thank you.
Wonderful. And the power of story, it really can change the world. um, even those of us who are social workers or therapists understand that your own narrative, once you change the narrative of your experiences, it can change your perspectives on it. So yes, story, very powerful. Um, then we'll go to Dr. Becerril. What kinds of praxis could you offer us as far as
That's
pedagogy?
such a perfect segue, and I know we're running out of time, so I threw my stuff in there in the chat, but kind of what I'm already doing and I feel great about is using those stories. So I teach an introductory course to communication disorders, and so we talk about people who stutter, people with voice disorders, we talk about people with swallowing disorders, we talk about people with autism and people who use alternative and augmentative forms of communication. They don't speak orally. We talk about people with hearing impairments and how that affects communication. And when I do that, I make sure to include the perspective of people with those disabilities. And so there's a saying in disability studies that says nothing for us that isn't by us. And there's a great New York Times article that came out this past summer. I included that link in there with really great sort of snippets. Jim Sinclair, he is part of this neurodiversity movement tied to autism. He has a saying, don't mourn for us, which is also really interesting. Some people, we come from a discipline that likes person first languaging. So a person with autism, a child with a language disability, but there's this like turn of phrase now. There's certain communities where, especially in the autism community and the stuttering community, where they want the opposite. They want to say, I am a person who stutters. I do have autism, and they don't see that right as this disability and this they don't want you to mourn for them. So there's just some really interesting topics to grapple with. And so I'm also really interesting, and I'm planning to attempt a PBL this upcoming fall semester, a problem-based learning project where students can decide on what real world and personally meaningful projects they want to engage in. And so there's a link to a picture of a gentleman in a wheelchair. He is Black, and it says on there, he's protesting, and it says half of all people killed by police have a disability. And it says end racist police terror. So there's that even a further connection, right? So we have not only our Black and brown people being killed by police, but people with disabilities are killed by police in outstanding numbers. And so just letting students connect to that, and I want to hear from them, like where do they want to take that? So I'm really interested in trying that. And I also put in the chat, because I know we have some other professors on here, I'm also really interested in interprofessional education, which leads to practice. So if there is anyone out there that wants to try this, try a project where different groups of students can get together and have these conversations, do a project-based learning assignment together. I think that's really cool too. So we can kind of share these perspectives. Thank you again.
Wonderful. So I know that we're supposed to end in an hour, but we started late. So I'd like to invite everyone to stay at least 10 minutes over to have a discussion with our panelists. And so I'd like to open it up for conversation. If anyone who's participating here has specific questions or also additional resources that they'd like to offer to dialogue about the subjects that we have been discussing, to go ahead and participate and ask your question.
And I also put in the chat that I would also love to hear about what each of you, I mean, we're surrounded by a lot of really great scholars in their own right. So I'd love to hear what you do in your classroom in each of these areas. So thank you again for being here. Dr. Leah Larson just commented, she's Crip Camp is an excellent documentary. Also, Beauty is a Verb, Poetry, and the Right Way to Be Crippled and Naked, which is fiction, both edited by Sheila Black, are excellent resources. Oh, thank you.
I don't want to call her out because I don't know what she's doing, but I see Yvette Lozano is on this call, and she is one of our incredible clinical faculty, and she has been a part of a wonderful summer camp for children who use these augmentative and alternative communication devices, and I'd love to know if she wanted to share any more about that and her involvement there, but she might be multitasking.
Yes, the main point of the camp is to train our graduate students who are clinicians, who are becoming clinicians, and also to help the clients and their families feel like we know that they are competent. And that's mainly what we want to promote, is competency and presume competency. And you see that I was going to mention Crip Camp also. That was also very fascinating and informative, because that whole movement, it's like, where do we ever get to hear about that? But and that's the same point, is like they are very capable, and we need to remember that that we have to presume competence, and we want to give them opportunities to communicate in a safe environment. Same thing with Crip Camp, and get them build their confidence to be able to do that with others outside of the camp.
Yes, those are all excellent resources, and thank you for leading that camp. I think that's very important work. I would also like to invite Dr. Cepeda to tell us about the edited volume that she put together, Teaching with Gloria Ansaldúa, and so that we can use that as a resource as well. Dr. Cepeda, would you like to tell us about your book?
Yeah, I just want to apologize. Apparently I put too much in chat. I can't chat right now. It's banned me from chat, and it's still glitching. So hopefully you could see me. Ultimately, our book has some sensational scholars who are practitioners of using Ansaldúa's theories, philosophies, and concepts in the classroom. We are quite proud of how well the book is doing, because one of the things that sometimes people who are new to the field of anti-racism or decolonizing theories or practices is, this is great, but how do I actually do the work other than read someone like Gloria's work as literature, which you definitely can. but she has some really applicable things to the classroom. So you'll find a variety of perspectives on how to translate her theories to actual practice with assignments, redesigning your syllabi, things that you possibly are doing or haven't thought about, using a course description, working with students directly in the office. I appreciate you very much uh, shouting out the book. It could be found anywhere that you purchase books. Check it out.
Wonderful. Yes, we should all have a copy if we're going to be engaging in this work over the summer. That's going to be an excellent resource as we.
Can I say one quick plug though, if you don't mind, as our
Of course.
I also want to use this space, since we have just a little bit time of also is there are individuals in this space who either were former department chairs or program heads. I'm part of a strategic planning committee 2.9 for looking at cultural inclusivity and equality, and our name is kind of going to evolve into something else, but we do have people who are actively involved in that committee. I want to also just let you know that the work of this committee is to provide recommendations of ways that we as a university, we could hold the university accountable to also modeling these theories and concepts across the board. And one of the things that I would like to move towards is in our annual faculty reviews, rather than just reflect on how we live up to our core values, but to provide an opportunity for all faculty to illustrate maybe 2 examples of something that you're proud of and how you modeled an inclusive classroom, or how you redesigned a classroom, or how you celebrate as a practitioner anti-racist pedagogy or decolonial pedagogy. We don't do that in this university. And hopefully our agenda will move forward, and you will see hopefully surveys. Please answer those surveys if you ever get them. And if you're interested in knowing more about that group, please feel free to reach out to me.
Yes, wonderful. And I'm happy to participate in that group with you. Also to tell everybody that we're all here, on campus. And if you're not at OLU, you can always contact us for more resources. And also I know that we're doing a lot of this work and it isn't, out there enough, and we don't get to share. And we are a teaching university with a 70% Latinx student population, majority minority student population. Also, a significant number of students with disabilities, as we found, or learning differences, communication differences. And so this is actually the laboratory, right, for experimentation. And also, even through our failures, finding the possibilities. And I think we really have the potential here at Our Lady of the Lake University to be a center, right, in which for pedagogy, for critical pedagogy, if we start to collaborate more and to get these practices out, as you have done, Dr. Cepeda, in your book as an edited volume, but also starting this process with Dr. Martinez and her group. And I can't name all of the individuals, she can do that at the end, who have started this conversation of critical pedagogy. So I very much appreciate all of your work and insights, and I will let Dr. Martinez give the final word here on Friday.
Well, thank you, Dr. Villarreal. And I just wanted to, add on to like the assignments too. I know that with Professor Vasquez, she gave that amazing presentation on decolonization kind of across your livelihood, including your diet. And that link should be on the OLU Center for Mexican American Studies Facebook page. So I definitely encourage you all to check that out if you haven't had a chance to. But there was a comment on our Facebook, because we're live right now, and Maddie Tabersmith, who works here and is just a guru at everything she does. But she said that student reflections can be a great assessment, because we're all near an assessment, right? Can be great assessment methods too. When graded on an aligned rubric, they are powerful and often more equitable assessment methods. And yes, and if we're looking at how we can decolonize even writing assignments, having the ability for students to write both informally and formally, right? Like so there's ways that you can incorporate these different methods through these little individual reflection papers, and we do so in my survey courses. You first begin with the these individual reflection papers and allow students to write as they, I know it's a terrible, right, to write as you talk, to conversate through, just let their words flow onto the paper as they are putting them together. And as a rhetorician, I'm sure Dr. Cepeda can appreciate that. So, and then you can also have the other formal writing methods as well. You can do both, right? And then Dr. Villarreal, I know she has an amazing assignment on looking at homescapes, right? So I don't know if you wanted to speak just a teensy tiny bit on that, because your assignments are also, I mean, very, very involving in practicing decolonization. So you can do this across Mexican American studies, ethnic studies, African American studies. We've all been kind of indigenous studies. We've all been doing this work for, as Dr. Cepeda said, for a while before even Dr. Kendi has made this, brought it to the forefront again, especially last year with this book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, which I also recommend. But Dr. Villarreal, talk about how you do that within that assignment, and then I'll close. I wanted to give you that opportunity because I love that assignment, Homescapes, and there's also for K through 12 out there, she has a lesson plan that you can incorporate into your K through 12 classes as well.
Yes, so homescapes is an idea of thinking about home and the various ways that we can carry home with us, the various ways that we create homes and senses of belonging, even in times of displacement, right? How we can recreate and our connections to home. So the first part of the assignment is to have students do a writing reflection in which they write how to get home, and how to get home in directions. So, okay, you're going to go down this street, or you need to take this flight, and then from there, you're going to drive this place. So actually, like how to get home, but that's the practical things. And then they also have to do intangible things of how they get home. And it could be through memory, it could be through smells, it could be through people. And some people, may not want to go home. Some people, like Gloria Anzaldúa says, they have homophobia, right? Fear of going home because home is homophobic. Different ways, right, in which we connect to home or disconnect from home. And so it begins there. And then we have all of these resources. And then they go through this process of displacement in which in groups they have to, there's been a disaster, and I don't name the disaster, but they have to leave home. And they can take two tangible things, okay, or maybe 2 to 5 tangible things that they are going to need to survive, and 5 non-tangible things like recipes, songs, ideas, memories. A lot of people want to take photographs, right, so that they can remember home. And so it could be religion, right? It could be stories, all kinds of intangible things as well. And so they have to strategize of how they're going to move, right? How they're being displaced. They have one day to leave. And so they get really into like how they're going to survive and whether they're going to take a car. And it's really interesting, how they're trying to think about how they're going to survive. And then we get together and they share, how they're going to recreate home in the new place and how they're going to survive. And so I say, okay, you've arrived at your new place. And I say, and they've listed on the board all the things they've taken, all the intangible things, all the tangible things. And so I say, you've arrived, but you had to sell your car in order to get food for your family. You had to exchange this resource in order to get water. And so little by little, everything gets checked off. And then I also say, the place where you arrived has outlawed your religion. And that goes off the board. the place that you've arrived has outlawed, your language. And it's a English only, or whatever only the language, you can't speak your language. And we start checking, and then by the end they have nothing, because the policies in the place where they've landed don't want them. Make sure that they're not going to survive, right? And so then they have this experience of loss, and it's really powerful because they see, like, they get so excited about recreating their home in this place, and then they end up with nothing as they arrive. And then I say, okay, so what are you going to do now? How are you going to recreate this homescape now in this new environment with all of these different oppressions and limitations? And so they have to find out different ways and different strategies to recreate home, and we do that collectively. And so that's the lesson of homescapes. So I have it written down, and I can send it to you if you'd like, and we'll post it on the SharePoint site, and you're welcome to adapt it in any way you'd like. But that's actually how I go through that process of homescapes.
Yeah, and it's a really great lesson plan. I was trying to find it. I thought we had it on our Must for Texas website, but I couldn't find it. But yes, so thank you, Dr. Villarreal, and thank you again to all the workshop facilitators as part of the CPA group with the curriculum pedagogy and admissions crew, which include Dr. Stephanie Becerril, Dr. Carol Jeffrey Horner, and Dr. Paul Stella and myself. We are thrilled that everybody's been participating in these throughout the year, and we hope to keep these conversations going. Like Dr. Cepeda has stated, this is not okay. I did my critical pedagogy. I'm done for the year. I'm done for the rest. This is a constant renewal. This is a constant moment of self-reflection as we go semester by semester in each of our classrooms as you engage with students. So we thank you again, and we hope that this becomes part of our institutional framework. So yes, thanks to all, and please let us know if you have any questions.
So for the panelists, I'd like the panelists to stay a little bit after, and anybody else is welcome to stay, but just to, if you have some time, maybe share some ideas about where to take the series for next semester. If you'd like to stay on and think through some of those ideas, I'd appreciate it. And everybody else, you're welcome to stay, you're welcome to leave. I don't want to hold you hostage in a WebEx room. Okay, we're not holding you hostage. And also panelists as well. So yes, thank you all for attending. I'm going to stop the recording now and the live stream.